The smell hit first wet rot, concrete dust, and panic. My backyard creek, the one that kept this whole neighborhood breathing, was gagged in gray, while HOA Karen posed with a clipboard like a conquering hero. They called my natural drainage a hazard and poured a coffin over it. That was the moment the injustice burned in fines for me, photo ops for them, and a signed death warrant for every foundation on this street. But here's what they forgot. Water keeps receipts. It memorizes every bend, every route, every place it's supposed to go. Block it and it doesn't disappear. It waits, it swells, it comes back with friends. This is my story from the first truckload of cement to the night the lawns turned to swamps and the red tags bloomed on front doors. You want a payoff. Stay with me to the end. The creek does not forgive. Before we dive in, drop your city and local time in the comments, and if you're new, hit subscribe for more real HOA drama. Karen Whitmore showed up like a bad sitcom character who never leaves the screen. It was a humid Saturday morning, the kind where the air felt heavy enough to chew, and I was halfway through fixing my fence when her SUV rolled up in front of my house. She stepped out in pastel yoga pants, clutching a clipboard like it was the 10 Commandments. Her smile was weaponized, too polite, too sharp. "Good morning. I'm with the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association," she announced, already walking up my porch. "We've had several complaints about an unauthorized water feature on your property." I blinked at her. "You mean my creek? The one that's been here since the Eisenhower administration?" She didn't even flinch. "Yes, that. It's unregulated. Standing water can be a safety issue, you know. Kids could drown, mosquitoes could breed." Lady, I interrupted, wiping sweat off my forehead. "If a kid can drown in 3 inches of running water, the problem isn't my creek." That didn't go over well. She pursed her lips, scribbled something furiously on her clipboard, and said, "I'll be issuing a notice of violation. You'll need to submit a plan to bring your property into compliance." Compliance. That word hit like a nail in the skull. I'd heard it all my life. Working in construction, compliance meant someone behind a desk thought they knew more about your land than you did. I told her as politely as possible to have a wonderful day, and that my creek wasn't going anywhere. 2 days later, I found a blue tape notice stuck to my door. Unauthorized landscape elements. Unsafe open water. Non-native wildlife presence. Non-native wildlife. I stared at that line for a full minute before laughing out loud. Apparently frogs were immigrants now. I ignored it. Mistake number 1. A week later came notice number 2 this time, threatening $100 per day in fines unless I submitted a mitigation plan. I wrote them a short letter quoting the county water code, attached a copy of my deed, showing the protected drainage easement, and thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong again. A week later, 3 strangers with measuring tapes showed up in my backyard, snapping photos like they were staging a crime scene. Karen stood at the property line, her arms crossed, directing them as if she was the foreman of some divine inspection team. I walked out with my coffee, leaned on the railing, and said, "You folks planning to fill out a permit for trespassing while you're here?" One of the men coughed awkwardly. Karen didn't even look at me. "We're performing a community standards evaluation," she said. "You'll receive a report within the week." They left muddy boot prints across my lawn. That was the day I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was an invasion. The following Thursday, my mailbox coughed up a thick envelope stamped "Mandatory HOA Meeting." Normally, I'd rather crawl through a sewer pipe than sit in a room full of people discussing lawn heights, but something told me to go. I parked outside the beige community center, walked into a sea of folding chairs and fake smiles, and took a seat in the back. Karen stood at the podium like a queen addressing her subjects. Behind her was a projector screen showing my property circled in red on a satellite photo. "This," she said dramatically, tapping the screen, "is a non-compliant water feature that poses a threat to neighborhood safety and property values." You could hear the whispers ripple through the room. One guy even muttered, "Isn't that just a creek?" Karen ignored him. "We've consulted with our environmental committee, and the homeowner," she glanced down at her notes like she didn't even remember my name, "has refused to cooperate. Therefore, the board recommends he be fined until the issue is resolved." That was it. No discussion, no chance to defend myself. I stood up and said, "For the record, that creek is older than every house in this neighborhood combined. It's on county maps as protected drainage. You fill it in, you flood this place." Karen smiled tight and plastic. "Sir, this meeting is not for personal arguments. You've been advised to comply." I took the microphone anyway. "Then consider this my official non-compliance." The room went quiet. A few neighbors smirked. Most just stared down at their phones. Karen's nostrils flared. "You're setting a dangerous precedent," she snapped. "I'm setting a boundary," I said. "One, you don't get to redraw with a clipboard." I left before the vote. They passed the motion without me, of course. OA boards always do. That weekend, I found my mailbox knocked off its post. Someone dumped a pile of landscaping rocks into the creek's bend, clogging the flow. I didn't need a detective to guess who orchestrated it. The next morning, I saw Karen parked across the street in her SUV, snapping pictures through the windshield. I waved. She didn't wave back. Over the next few weeks, the letters multiplied. Failure to maintain property standards, unapproved natural growth, evidence of erosion. It was like they'd hired a poet to describe dirt. I kept everything, every notice, every timestamp, every photo of her parked outside my house, like some HOA paparazzi. I wasn't ready to strike yet, but I was taking notes. Because the thing about people like Karen is that they're predictable. They push until something breaks, usually themselves. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood started changing. The Creekside homes, mine included, had always been a little rougher around the edges. We were the old-timers, the ones who'd been here before the HOA came along with their matching mailboxes and their synchronized porch lights. But now the beige army was moving in, folks who believed conformity was a virtue, who mowed their lawns twice a week and filed complaints if your trash can was visible from the street. They looked at me like I was the problem, the man with the rogue creek, the holdout. One guy, a newer resident named Brad, stopped me while I was checking the mail. "Hey man," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "Karen says your property's flooding the common area. Any truth to that, Brad?" I said, "If my creek's flooding anything, it's because your HOA dumped rocks in it." He blinked. "Huh. She didn't mention that." Of course she didn't. A week later, an official-looking envelope arrived thicker than the rest. It was a final compliance order. Either I fenced the entire creek, filled it, or submitted to weekly inspections for 12 months at my expense. The cost $4,700. I laughed so hard I almost spilled my coffee. Then I drafted a single-sentence reply. "Respectfully, the only thing I'm filling is my coffee cup." I sent it certified mail just to make sure they got it. From that day on, Karen stopped pretending to be friendly. She'd glare when she passed me at the mailbox, whisper to other board members during community walks, and once she even had a landscaper drop a pamphlet about safe water feature removal in my driveway. But she made one mistake. She underestimated how patient I could be. Every war has two phases, the loud one and the quiet one. She'd started the loud phase with her rules and threats. Now it was my turn to get quiet, to watch, wait, and let her dig her own hole. Or in this case, pour it. Because while Karen thought she was controlling the narrative, I was preparing mine. Photos, documents, drone shots, even old county maps from the 1,950 seconds showing the creek as part of a permanent watershed corridor. If she wanted a war, I'd give her one with the kind of ammunition you can't argue with proof. By late August, the tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to taste. People were choosing sides. Some whispered that the HOA was going too far. Others avoided eye contact altogether. But Karen, she was doubling down, talking about beautification projects and community safety measures. That's HOA language for, "We're about to do something incredibly stupid." And when the cement truck showed up at dawn one Wednesday morning, that's exactly what they did. But that, my friends, is a story for the next part, because when that gray slurry started pouring into my backyard, it wasn't just concrete hitting the ground. It was the beginning of the end for Karen the HOA, and every smug little rule that thought it could outsmart the rain. It started like any other Wednesday, quiet, damp, and promising nothing but another ordinary day. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when I heard a deep mechanical growl rolling through the neighborhood. At first, I thought it was city maintenance, finally fixing the crater-sized pothole on Maple Drive. But then the sound grew closer. Too close. The kind of close that vibrates your coffee mug on the table. When I stepped onto the back porch, the sight that met me didn't make sense. A white Crown Mix concrete truck was crawling down the narrow alley beside my house hazard lights, flashing a man in a neon vest, waving his arms and shouting directions like he was guiding an airplane. The driver eased the vehicle down until the chute hovered directly over the bend of my creek, and that was when my stomach dropped. I shouted before my brain even caught up. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The man in the vest barely glanced at me. He looked tired, like someone who'd been yelled at before breakfast. "Work order, sir," he said over the engine noise. "Drainage mitigation project approved by the HOA." My heart slammed against my ribs. "You're pouring concrete into a live waterway. That's not mitigation, that's murder," he shrugged. "Not my call." And before I could take another step, the driver pulled a lever. A thick gray slurry gushed from the chute, splattering into the creek bed with a sound halfway between a splash and a death rattle. The water hissed and bubbled as the cement spread like a disease, swallowing pebbles, weeds, and the small frogs that called it home. I sprinted down the yard, slipping in the mud, yelling every curse word I knew. "Stop. You don't have permission to be here." But they didn't stop. They didn't even look at me. By the time I reached the bank, the first 20 feet of my creek were gone, entombed under a smooth, gray crust. I could feel the heat of the chemical reaction radiating from it, smell the acrid bite of fresh mix burning the air. One of the frogs leapt from the mess, too late, half its legs stuck in the hardening concrete. My stomach twisted. The vest guy finally turned clipboard in hand, expression blank. "You'll have to take it up with the HOA, sir. We're just contractors." "Contractors don't get to trespass," I snapped, voice shaking with fury. "Show me the permit." He flipped the clipboard shut without a word, motioned to the driver, and the truck groaned forward, pouring another wave of gray death. I lunged, nearly slipped again, and ended up on my knees in the mud as the last trickle of my creek vanished. The sound of the cement drum faded down the alley until all that was left was silence and the slow, steady drip of what used to be running water. That silence hurt more than anything. When I finally looked up, Karen Whitmore was standing on the sidewalk, umbrella closed, arms crossed, wearing a smile that could have cut glass. She didn't say a word, just tilted her head as if to ask, "Still think you can defy us?" I wiped mud and blood from my arm, straightened up, and smiled right back. "Enjoy your victory, Karen," I said under my breath. "You just picked a fight with gravity." That night the rain came. It wasn't a storm, not yet, just a soft drizzle whispering against the porch roof. I sat outside anyway, beer in hand, staring at the long gray scar that now split my backyard. The concrete gleamed wet and lifeless under the porch light, a wound that refused to heal. I used to fall asleep to the sound of that creak. It was like a heartbeat, steady and familiar. Now it was gone, and the silence was suffocating. I thought about calling the county inspector, maybe even a lawyer, but deep down I already knew what I needed to do: wait. Because water doesn't forget. 2 days later, the first signs appeared. A small puddle in the corner of the yard that refused to drain. Then another. The grass around the concrete turned yellow, the soil bloated and sour. Across the street, the manicured lawns began to sag just a little at first, barely noticeable, unless you knew what to look for. I knew. By the weekend, the forecast promised a minor rain event. Around here, that meant expect a downpour. I sat on my porch that Sunday morning, coffee growing cold, and watched as gray clouds muscled across the horizon like slow-moving battleships. The first drop hit my arm at noon. By 1 o'clock, the gutters were overflowing. By 2, the entire neighborhood sounded like a waterfall. Normally, the creek would have handled it. That little ribbon of water had taken care of every storm for decades, swallowing runoff from half the subdivision and quietly carrying it downstream. But this time there was no creek, just a sealed trench of concrete. The water had nowhere to go. It started pooling in the low spots first, around the bend behind my shed, then creeping across the yard toward the patio. Within an hour, my lawn was a shallow lake. The storm drains on Maple Drive gurgled, then choked. Water began pushing back through them, bubbling up like miniature geysers. I grabbed my phone and started recording. Across the street, Karen stood under a massive umbrella, barking into her phone. Her pristine front yard had become a shallow swamp. I could hear her voice shrill, even over the rain. "No, it's not supposed to happen. The drainage project was approved. You said it would stop this." I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The rain didn't let up until midnight. By then, half the neighborhood was underwater. Lawns drowned. Flower beds washed away. The cul-de-sac at the bottom of the hill turned into a pond, deep enough for ducks to land. When morning came, the damage was undeniable. Mrs. Jensen, the sweet old widow at the corner, woke up to find her basement carpet squishing under her feet. The Alvarez family spent the morning stacking sandbags along their front steps. Even Brad, the guy who once believed every word Karen said, stood in his driveway, staring at a pool of oily water lapping at his garage door. The HOA's official response came by evening, a neatly formatted email blaming residents for improper lawn grading and failure to maintain personal drainage systems. It was so absurd I actually laughed out loud. I printed the email, highlighted the sentence, "The HOA bears no liability," and taped it to my fridge like a trophy. Over the next week, the neighborhood turned tense. Everyone was angry, but nobody wanted to admit who they were angry at. Some blamed the city, some blamed each other, but nobody dared say the truth. This was all Karen's fault. HOA trucks started making the rounds, checking for flood-prone zones. A few volunteers with clipboards, Karen's new flood mitigation committee, wandered door to door, taking notes that would later become fines. When they reached my house, I met them at the gate. "Backyard's off limits," I said flatly. "Sir," one of them stammered, "we're required to inspect, then get a warrant." Karen was in the group, of course. She smiled that same corporate smile, the one that always hid a threat. "You know, Ethan," she said sweetly, "you could make this easier on yourself. Fill in the rest of that ditch and we'll consider the matter closed." I stared at her for a long moment, then pointed past her shoulder. "You might want to start with your front yard, Karen. It's trying to swim away." She didn't look back, but her smile cracked just enough for me to see it. By the end of the month, the neighborhood looked like a bad joke. Driveways cracked. Lawns sank. The asphalt along Maple Drive rippled like fabric. You couldn't take a walk without stepping into ankle-deep water somewhere. And through it all, Karen doubled down. She sent another letter accusing me of failure to cooperate with environmental restoration directives. Translation: "You didn't obey me." I filed it with the rest in a neat little binder labeled Evidence. I had photos, videos, timestamps enough to make a city inspector salivate. But I wasn't ready yet. Not until the next big storm, not until the damage was impossible to spin. Because that's the thing about revenge. You don't rush it. You let it simmer. You let it become inevitable. And while Karen was out there screaming at puddles and writing violation letters, I was in my workshop cleaning the lens on my old Nikon, charging drone batteries, and printing every law, ordinance, and environmental code I could find. I wasn't planning to shout. I was planning to bury them in paperwork this time. Because when you pour concrete over nature, you might silence it for a while. But sooner or later, nature finds its voice again. And when it speaks, it doesn't whisper. It roars. The creek was gone, but the water wasn't. And deep under that slab of arrogance and cement, I could already hear it, pressing, pushing, remembering, waiting. The next storm didn't just rain, it arrived like an accusation. You could feel it building for days, the air heavy, the clouds swollen, and low the wind carrying that metallic scent that warns you nature's about to collect a debt. I was on my porch again, nursing a mug of burnt diner coffee, when the first rumble cracked across the sky. The kind that makes the windows hum and dogs go silent. At first I told myself it couldn't get worse than the last flood. Foolish optimism. When it comes to water, worse is always an option. The rain came down sideways, hammering the roof and drowning out the sound of my neighbor's generator. It didn't fall, it attacked. Within 20 minutes, the gutters overflowed sheets of runoff, racing down driveways and pooling in every low spot. The cul-de-sac turned into a whirlpool, spinning leaves, mulch, and lost soccer balls into a muddy vortex. Normally my creek would have laughed this off. It had handled decades of spring storms without so much as a puddle. But now that natural artery was a clogged vein, the concrete they'd poured was smooth, sealed, and utterly useless. Water didn't flow, it rebounded. It turned on itself, swirling in confused circles, before surging sideways into places it was never meant to go. Across the street, I saw the first flash of panic. The Alvarez family, the same folks who'd once backed Karen's beautification plan, were dragging out sandbags, shouting over the roar of rain. Their youngest, a kid no older than 10, was crying as water lapped over the porch step. Mrs. Jensen's basement lights flickered once, twice, and then died. And through it all, Karen stood on her porch under that oversized beach umbrella, the kind you take to the Hamptons to look rich. Her pristine garden, her sacred rose bushes, her stone fountain, they were all drowning. I could see her lips moving, probably blaming me or the city or the ghost of whoever built this land before she came along. By midnight, the power went out. The only light came from lightning and the red glow of taillights as people tried stupidly to drive through the flooded street. I stayed put, sitting on the porch with a flashlight and my camera filming it all. Because I knew exactly what was happening, the land was reclaiming its path. When dawn finally clawed through the clouds, the neighborhood looked like a war zone. Mud streaks up driveways, lawns torn open, flower beds scattered like confetti. The smell, swamp, and sewage and shame hung thick in the air. I walked the perimeter of my yard in rubber boots, camera in hand, documenting everything where the water pooled, where it rose, where it pushed against the concrete and forced cracks to spiderweb through the surface. The first crack appeared right at the bend where the truck had poured the heaviest. Hairline thin but long stretching, almost 5 feet. I crouched down, ran my gloved fingers along it, and felt a tiny pulse of cold water bubbling up from underneath. The creek wasn't dead. It was breathing. I smiled. That week, the HOA sent out another email, this one practically glowing with arrogance. To all Maple Ridge residents, please note that recent weather events have revealed issues with individual property maintenance. Homeowners are responsible for ensuring their yards are properly graded and their private drainage systems are functioning. Translation: not our fault. They even added a new fine schedule, $75 per day, for failure to maintain adequate runoff control. The audacity was Olympic level. I printed that one too and pinned it next to the others on my fridge. My personal gallery of stupidity. Karen wasn't done, of course. She scheduled a mandatory community meeting to address ongoing drainage challenges. I almost didn't go, but something in me wanted to see how far she'd stretch the lie. The meeting was chaos wrapped in beige wallpaper. The community center smelled like wet carpet and resentment. About 30 residents showed up, most of them tired, soaked, and pissed. Karen strutted in late laptop under her arm, wearing rain boots that probably cost more than my truck. She started with her usual corporate chirp. "Thank you all for coming. I know it's been a difficult few weeks, but we're working hard on solutions." "Like concrete," someone muttered from the back. A few people snickered. Karen ignored it. "We've brought in a landscaping consultant who's developing a new drainage inspection program. It will be mandatory, but it's for everyone's benefit." "How much?" Mrs. Jensen's voice cracked from the second row. Karen smiled. $250 per household, but... She didn't even finish. Half the room erupted. Someone shouted, "We're not paying for your mistake," another yelled, "You caused this mess." The tension snapped like a power line. I just sat there, arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. Karen tried to restore order with that tight, brittle smile. "Let's be adults here," she said, her voice rising above the noise. "We need cooperation, not blame." I raised my hand. "I'll cooperate when you explain why my creek is full of cement." The room went silent. Every head turned toward me. Karen blinked. "That's not your creek, Ethan. That was common property that had to be stabilized." I pulled a folded copy of my deed from my jacket pocket and held it up. "Funny, this says otherwise." Her lips parted just for a second. Then the mask slid back on. "I'm not discussing private matters in a public meeting." "That's fine," I said, standing up, "because I'm done talking. Next time I'll be discussing it with the county." And I left. The next few days I became the HOA's favorite ghost. They tried to contact me, letters, phone calls, even a friendly visit from one of their board members named Dennis, who looked like a retired substitute teacher. I didn't answer the door. Instead, I spent my nights in the garage, surrounded by files, maps, and photos. My evidence folder was turning into a small library. I documented every storm, every flood, every puddle that refused to drain. I used my old drone to capture aerial footage, those bird's-eye shots that showed the entire neighborhood slumping into a bowl of trapped water. The pattern was undeniable. Everything flooded outward from the exact spot where the creek had been sealed. It was science, not opinion. And science doesn't care about bylaws. Still, Karen pushed her campaign of denial. She sent out newsletters full of jargon, surface saturation, unexpected hydrological events, runoff redistribution. She used so many big words that most people didn't realize she was saying nothing. But the cracks in her empire weren't just in the concrete anymore. They were in the people. Neighbors who once smiled at her now avoided eye contact. The HOA's online forum turned toxic. One post read, "Anyone else's basement smell like mold and regret." That one got 73 likes before Karen deleted it. By the second storm of the month, the neighborhood was unraveling. Water flowed under fences, over sidewalks, and straight into living rooms. The city's emergency hotline was jammed with calls from Maple Ridge residents reporting unexplained flooding. Unexplained. That word made me laugh out loud. There was nothing unexplained about it. The creek was reclaiming its path, slowly, quietly, with the patience only nature possesses. The night before the third big storm, I went outside with a flashlight. The air buzzed with humidity, the sky bruised and electric. I crouched near the cracked section of concrete, watching a thin stream of water ooze through the fissure, winding across the soil, like a finger tracing an old memory. "It was coming back," I whispered. "Good, you remember." Then I set up 2 cameras, one facing the creek, one facing the street, and waited. Because tomorrow the sky was going to open again, and this time I'd have every second on film. At dawn, the rain started with surgical precision. By noon, it was biblical. The new footage showed water hammering the concrete, finding every weakness, pushing, probing, prying. Small rivulets became streams. Streams merged into torrents. The concrete split again, a jagged crack tearing through the middle like lightning frozen in stone. By evening, water was running through my backyard once more, not wild but determined. The ghost of the creek had come alive. It was taking its shape back. When the storm finally subsided, I stepped outside into knee-deep water. My neighbors were bailing out their basements, screaming into phones, dragging soggy furniture into driveways. Across the street, Karen stood on her porch in rubber boots, mascara running, yelling at a city truck that had come to assess the damage. I couldn't hear her words over the sound of frogs croaking again from somewhere near the broken concrete. I smiled. Nature was back. And this time, it wasn't taking orders from the HOA. It didn't take long for the neighborhood to start looking like a failed experiment. Within 2 weeks after the last storm, Maple Ridge went from exclusive suburban community to swamp with a homeowners association. The lawns had lost their shine, the air smelled like mildew and fertilizer, and the sound of sump pumps had replaced the gentle hum of sprinklers. You could see it in everyone's eyes. The denial phase was over. They all knew something was wrong. They just didn't know how wrong. Karen, of course, had an explanation for everything. She blamed unprecedented rainfall. She blamed city infrastructure. She even blamed poor homeowner landscaping choices. Anything but the obvious, the concrete tomb they'd poured into my creek. But denial only works until the ground starts to move. It began with a rumor. Someone said their patio had sunk an inch overnight. Then another homeowner found a crack zigzagging up the side of their garage like a lightning scar. Within a week, half the street had something breaking, tilting, or sagging. Retaining walls bulged, mailboxes leaned. Even the asphalt on Maple Drive began to buckle under the invisible pressure of trapped water beneath. I kept quiet, observed, documented. Every morning I'd walk the block with my camera pretending to be an amateur nature photographer. In reality, I was capturing the slow-motion collapse of an empire built on arrogance. The water table was rising beneath the neighborhood, like a sleeping giant stretching its arms, and the HOA, with all its committees and bylaws, couldn't stop it. One afternoon, I caught Brad, the same neighbor who used to believe every word Karen said, kneeling in his driveway staring at a crack that had split the concrete clean in half. "Looks bad," I said, approaching with my coffee. He sighed. "It wasn't there yesterday. I think the ground's sinking." I nodded. "It's not the ground, Brad. It's the water under it. Can't drain anymore." He looked at me confused, then realization slowly dawned. I pointed toward the bend of my backyard where the concrete trench shimmered under the sunlight. He followed my gaze and swore under his breath. Karen's version of events wasn't going to hold much longer. A few nights later, I attended another HOA meeting, this one called Emergency Session on Property Integrity. The title alone reeked of desperation. When I arrived, the parking lot was packed. People were arguing before they even got through the doors. Inside, the air was humid and angry. Karen stood at the front again, this time flanked by two men in matching polos embroidered with premier landscaping and drainage solutions. She launched straight into damage control. "First, let's all take a breath," she said, palms up like a yoga instructor trying to calm feral cats. "We're aware of the structural issues some residents are experiencing. We're coordinating with professionals to address them." One of the men stepped forward. "We've analyzed the terrain, and our early findings indicate soil displacement due to increased rainfall patterns. We recommend immediate installation of supplemental drainage basins." "Basins?" Mrs. Jensen's voice cut through the room. "You mean more holes?" He hesitated. "Controlled retention systems, ma'am. Like the creek we used to have," someone shouted. Laughter and murmurs rippled across the crowd. Karen's smile faltered. "That creek was a liability," she snapped, voice rising. "It was unsafe, unregulated, and it threatened our property values." I stood up slowly. "And now your property values are what?" Half underwater heads turned. Cameras came out. Karen's face flushed pink, then red. "Mr. Cole, this is not your forum to grandstand." "Funny," I said, stepping closer, "because the forum you're standing on used to be my drainage system." People started clapping. A few even cheered. The landscaper guys looked like they wanted to melt into the carpet. Karen tried to talk over the noise. "Enough. This negativity helps no one. We need unity." "What we need," I said, "is a shovel and some common sense." The meeting collapsed into shouting after that. Karen stormed out halfway through, muttering something about defamation. But the damage was done not to the houses, not yet, but to her authority. The crowd no longer believed her. That weekend, things went from bad to biblical. A slow, relentless drizzle settled in for 3 straight days. It wasn't heavy, but it never stopped. The ground had nowhere to send the water, so it just kept rising an underground tide. Basements filled. Gardens turned into bogs. Even the perfectly leveled sidewalks began to tilt. By Sunday morning, the Hendersons' retaining wall gave out completely. The sound was like a shotgun blast followed by a low groan as the entire structure slid 3 feet downhill. I caught it on camera. The HOA's Pride and Joy community trail now ended in a crater of mud and rebar. Karen's response. Another email. "Due to unusual soil saturation, please limit outdoor activity. The HOA is exploring solutions." Exploring, sure. Like a toddler exploring a power outlet. I decided to up my game. Using my drone, I flew a grid pattern over the entire development, taking hundreds of photos. From above, the neighborhood looked diseased, dark water stains spreading outward from the spot where the creek used to run. I overlaid those shots on an old county drainage map, and the result made me laugh out loud. The HOA had literally built their entire subdivision on top of a natural watershed and then sealed its arteries with concrete. They hadn't just ignored nature, they'd suffocated it. And now nature was exhaling. By midweek, panic set in. Residents were openly defying the HOA now, digging trenches, buying sump pumps, stacking sandbags without permission. The board sent violation warnings to half the block, but nobody cared. The power of a fine means nothing when your living room smells like swamp water. Karen tried to regain control by creating a flood response task force. She put herself in charge naturally. Her big idea: hire another contractor to reroute surface water into existing storm drains. Except there was one problem: those storm drains already overflowed every time it rained. I watched from my porch as her hired crew showed up with shovels and good intentions. They dug a trench across the greenbelt to redirect the runoff, but instead of fixing anything, they just gave the water a shortcut straight toward her house. By that evening, her front lawn looked like a rice paddy. She called the crew back the next day, screaming so loudly I could hear her from my porch. They packed up their gear and left before noon. And me, I just kept filming, documenting, waiting. Because I knew we were close to the tipping point, the moment where all the little cracks, both in the concrete and in Karen's authority, would give way to something bigger, something irreversible. That night, thunder rolled over the hills again. The storm warnings were back on TV. 100-year event, the weatherman called it. I smiled into my coffee. Perfect timing. Before heading to bed, I checked my cameras one last time. The lens pointed at the concrete scar in my backyard captured something almost poetic: tiny streams of water snaking through the cracks, glinting under lightning flashes like silver veins returning to life. The creek was coming back. And when the morning came, it wouldn't just take the dirt and fences with it. It would take her. Karen Whitmore, the clipboard queen of concrete, was about to learn the oldest rule in the book: you can fine a man all you want, but you can't fine the earth. The sky that morning looked bruised, dark, swollen, and ready to break. It wasn't just another rainstorm on the radar. It was a monster. The local station called it a historic convergence of cold and tropical fronts, but everyone in Maple Ridge just called it what it was: karma. By noon, the air tasted metallic, the kind of pressure that makes your ears ache. The first drops were fat and cold, splattering against the porch railing like warning shots. I sat there, same folding chair, same coffee mug, and watched as the neighborhood that had mocked me for months braced for a beating. The first gust hit at 1, 2, 3, 7. Trees bent sideways, their leaves turning silver in the wind. The rain didn't fall, it came sideways in sheets, hammering everything it touched. Within minutes, the road vanished beneath a curtain of rushing water. Gutters, overflowed storm drains, belched like geysers, and the ground began to move. I'd seen heavy rain before, but nothing like this. The sound was overwhelming, a constant roar that swallowed everything. The kind of noise that makes you realize how small you really are. Across the street, Karen was outside again, because of course she was. Umbrella flipped inside out, shouting into her phone, waving one manicured hand at the rising water as if she could scold it into obedience. Her voice was a tinny echo against the thunder. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who tried to control everything was now screaming at a storm. The flood started where it always did, right where the creek used to run. Only now there was no channel to guide it. The water surged against the concrete, then sideways across yards, battering fences and carrying mulch like confetti. I filmed the whole thing from the porch rain, slanting across the lens, my camera clicking like a heartbeat. Then came the cracking sound. It was faint at first, a hollow pop from somewhere beneath the surface. Then another louder. And then it happened. The concrete trench behind my house split wide open, a jagged seam that tore through the middle like the earth itself was sighing in relief. A fountain of muddy water burst upward, spraying soil pebbles and bits of rebar. The trapped pressure from months of rain and blocked runoff exploded free. The creek was alive again, angry, primal, unstoppable. I barely had time to step back before the water surged forward, carving through the split concrete, washing away months of HOA arrogance in one violent rush. It didn't stop there. The surge cut through my yard, then the next following its old natural course like it had never forgotten. Within minutes it tore straight under the road. Asphalt buckled, driveways collapsed. I heard screams from down the block, people scrambling to get out as the water ate the earth beneath their feet. For a moment I thought about running to help, but I didn't. Not because I didn't care, but because there was nothing anyone could do. You don't fight a flood, you survive it. I watched as Karen's perfect garden vanished beneath a rolling tide of brown water. Her prized fountain toppled rose bushes torn from their beds like paper. The water climbed her steps, reached her door, and pushed it open as if the house itself had invited the storm inside. She screamed a sound that cut through the thunder, raw and desperate. Then she disappeared inside. By nightfall, the storm had become a living thing. The power went out. The only light came from flashes of lightning reflecting off the floodwater that now reached my porch. Somewhere nearby, a transformer exploded, turning the sky green for a split second. I sat there soaked, shivering and weirdly calm. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also beautiful. The land was resetting itself. When dawn came, the silence was eerie. The rain had stopped leaving behind a fog that hovered like steam over the drowned streets. Cars were half submerged, mailboxes bent at odd angles. The neighborhood looked like a half-sunken model town in a child's bathtub. I walked carefully through ankle-deep water, camera in hand. The concrete trench was gone, torn apart, shattered, erased. In its place was a winding channel of raw earth, the creek's ghost resurrected. Frogs croaked somewhere under the fog. The smell of wet soil filled the air. The first people emerged slowly from their homes, dazed and wordless. Brad stumbled out of his garage carrying a ruined toolbox. The Alvarez kids stood on the curb, holding hands, staring at the mess. Mrs. Jensen sat on her porch steps with a soaked blanket around her shoulders, whispering a prayer. And then there was Karen. She stood in front of what used to be her dream house, barefoot hair matted to her face, her silk robe plastered to her skin. The front door hung crooked mud, streaking the frame. Her perfect white columns were cracked straight through the middle. Behind her, the foundation had sunk nearly 6 inches. She saw me standing across the street. For once, there was no clipboard, no fake smile. Just a woman staring at the ruins of everything she'd built. Her lips moved, but the only word I caught was why. I didn't answer, because deep down she already knew. The city inspectors showed up within 48 hours. 2 white trucks, hazard lights, flashing orange vests, gleaming in the fog. They walked the neighborhood in silence, taking photos, measuring cracks, jotting notes. When they reached my property, I showed them everything: photos, videos, copies of the old drainage easement, even my drone footage from before the first flood. They didn't say much, just exchanged looks and nodded. By the end of the week, bright orange UN-safe structure tags bloomed across more than a dozen homes, including Karen's. The city condemned half the cul-de-sac pending soil stabilization. In plain English, the ground was too unstable to live on. Karen tried to fight it, of course. She called a lawyer, screamed at the inspectors, accused me of tampering with the terrain, but the facts didn't care about her feelings. The water had spoken louder than any argument. Insurance companies followed soon after. Denied claims, negligence, failure to maintain natural drainage, no payouts, no exceptions. By the 3rd week, moving trucks clogged the streets. The once perfect lawns were littered with furniture, appliances, soaked cardboard boxes. You could smell the mold from 50 feet away. The luxury neighborhood had become a disaster zone. I helped where I could, passing out bottled water, lending tools, but I didn't gloat. I didn't have to. The land had already delivered the verdict. Karen stayed the longest. You could see her at dusk, standing by her mailbox, staring at nothing. Her house leaned slightly to one side, now a slow-motion collapse. The lights never came back on. And then one morning, she was gone. A rusted RV sat in her driveway for a day, then disappeared. The only thing she left behind was the faded HOA sign at the entrance. "Welcome to Maple Ridge, a community of excellence." Someone spray-painted over it later that week. A community of consequences. When the inspectors came back for follow-up surveys, they called it irreversible environmental damage. The county ordered a full drainage restoration project. Volunteers showed up with shovels, planting native grasses and willows, pulling away the broken concrete piece by piece. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the creek returned. Not exactly how it used to be, but alive, babbling softly through the backyard, carrying bits of sunlight in its ripples. I stood beside it, mud up to my boots, watching dragonflies hover over the water. The land smelled clean again. Whole. The HOA was officially dissolved 2 months later. The board members resigned in disgrace. Karen's name became a local punchline, a warning whispered in neighboring developments: "Don't pull a Maple Ridge." As for me, I rebuilt my fence, planted a few trees, and carved a small wooden sign at the head of the creek: "Nature always wins." Because it does. And as I sat there one quiet evening, listening to the water whisper through the stones, I realized something: I hadn't just won against the HOA. I'd helped the land win back itself. No courtroom could have given me that kind of justice. The flood had washed away the lies, the arrogance, the concrete. What remained was truth, raw, patient, and eternal, the kind that doesn't need approval from any board, the kind that endures. 3 days after the city declared Maple Ridge a disaster zone, I went digging through my garage, literally and figuratively. The storm had passed, but the damage wasn't over. It had only peeled back the surface. Beneath the mud and ruin, the land still pulsed with trapped water. The ground groaned when you stepped on it. Every time I moved, my boots sank half an inch deeper, as if the earth itself wanted to swallow the neighborhood whole. Inside my garage was chaos: tools, rusting boxes, soaked papers warped from humidity. I was looking for a tarp when I stumbled across a dusty metal filing cabinet wedged behind an old toolbox. It was dented, painted a dull army green, the kind that probably came from my grandfather's workshop. I hadn't opened it in years. When I yanked it open, the bottom drawer stuck halfway, jammed by something thick. After a few tugs, it gave way, and out slid a battered blue envelope, edges yellowed with age, sealed with brittle tape, and marked in my grandfather's neat, looping handwriting. For the property owner, do not discard. I sat right there on the concrete floor, rain still dripping from the rafters, and tore it open. Inside was a stack of documents, old survey maps from the 1,952nd County, letters stamped in fading ink, and a certified notice from the Colorado Water and Soil Authority, dated 1978. My grandfather had kept everything. The letterhead read, "This property contains a designated natural drainage easement classified under State Environmental Protection Code 12.7b. No alteration, obstruction, or infill permitted without county and state approval." There it was, proof. Legal, sealed, and irrefutable. My creek wasn't just a water feature. It was a protected watershed corridor. Karen's concrete stunt hadn't just broken HOA rules, it had violated state law. For a long moment, I just stared at the papers. The storm outside had gone quiet, replaced by the rhythmic drip of water through the broken gutter. It was almost poetic. Nature had already done the punishing, but now I had the paperwork to finish the job. The next morning, I drove to the county office. The clerk, a middle-aged guy with tired eyes and a permanent coffee stain on his shirt, barely looked up when I placed the envelope on the counter. "Got a violation to report," I said. "Environmental?" he asked, flipping the envelope open. "Yeah. HOA poured concrete into a protected drainage." That got his attention. He read through the documents, eyebrows rising higher with each page. This is from the Water and Soil Authority itself. You're saying they filled it in?" "Not saying," I replied, sliding my phone across the counter. "Showing." I played him the video, the cement truck, the workers, Karen watching from the sidewalk like some suburban general. When it ended, the clerk just whistled low. "Damn," he muttered. "That's bad, real bad." He called over another inspector, a woman with sharp eyes and a badge that read Environmental Enforcement Division. She studied the footage, flipped through the maps, then asked, "You said this was done by the HOA?" "Not the county HOA," I confirmed. "Unauthorized, unpermitted, and stupid." She didn't laugh. She just said, "We'll open an investigation immediately." I went home and waited. But waiting doesn't mean sitting still. I'd learned that lesson from the creek. It's always moving, even underground. So I spent the next few days quietly feeding the story to the right places. Anonymous email accounts. Local reporters. The Colorado Suburban Watchdog Facebook group that Karen had banned me from last year. I sent everything: drone, photos, videos, the letter from 1978, even HOA meeting notes I'd collected. And then, like all good storms, it began with a whisper. A short news blurb on Channel 5: local homeowners association under investigation for alleged environmental violations linked to community flooding. No names yet, but the footage said it all. Drone shots of our half-drowned streets, the cracked driveways, the toppled fences. I didn't even have to guess who leaked the visuals. My anonymous Dropbox link was right there in the corner of the screen. Within 24 hours, it was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, HOA destroys creek, floods itself. People couldn't get enough. Karen tried to spin it, of course. She posted a long message on the HOA site blaming rogue contractors and miscommunication with county guidelines. It was a solid wall of corporate nonsense, and no one was buying it. The next morning, the county trucks arrived. 2 white vans, a soil analysis unit, and an environmental inspection crew with clipboards and cameras. They went door to door, taking samples, measuring depths, photographing every damaged foundation. Karen stormed out in her robe, waving her arms, shouting about trespassing. One of the inspectors calmly showed her the official warrant. She went quiet for the first time in her life. By afternoon, they reached my property. The The lead inspector, a tall woman named Miss Ramsey, walked straight to the ruined trench, crouched down, and tapped the exposed concrete with her boot. It cracked under the touch. She stood, looked at me, and said, "You were right. This was illegal." "Yeah," I said deadpan. "Tell that to Karen," she smirked. "Oh, we will." 2 days later, the headline hit the local paper: "County finds HOA guilty of illegal drainage modification, possible criminal charges pending." The article listed the violations one by one: environmental code, breaches, destruction of protected watershed, obstruction of natural runoff, and endangerment of residential infrastructure. Each carried fines, some carrying potential jail time if proven deliberate. And at the center of it all, Karen Whitmore listed as the acting official responsible for project authorization. By noon, she was trending on local social media. Someone dug up her old Facebook posts, bragging about beautifying the community. They paired them with before and after shots of her sinking house. The internet did what the internet does: it feasted. That night, an emergency HOA meeting was called. I went, of course. Call it morbid curiosity. The community center was packed. The smell of mildew and wet carpet lingered from the flood. Karen stood at the podium, hair-frizzed, face pale, clutching a folder like it could save her. "This," she said, slamming the folder down, "is all a misunderstanding. The county has overstepped." They overstepped. Brad interrupted from the front row. "Lady, my garage collapsed." "My insurance won't cover anything," shouted someone else. "You told us this would stop the flooding," another yelled. The room erupted. Shouts, curses, accusations. Karen tried to talk over them, voice cracking. "It's not my fault. The contractors misread the plans." One of the quieter board members, an older man named Howard, stood up. "Karen," he said softly, "you signed the plans." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the air. Karen's mouth opened, then closed again. Her hands trembled. Howard sighed. "We're done here. The board is voting to dissolve the HOA, effective immediately." And that was it. No applause, no cheers, just exhausted relief. Karen gathered her papers, her empire reduced to soggy printouts, and walked out without a word. I stayed behind after everyone left. The projector still hummed softly, casting light on the cracked walls. On the screen was the last image from the county report, a photo of the creek, half reborn, cutting its way through the ruins of the concrete. I stared at it for a long time. Then I smiled, because the land had already written the ending. All I'd done was make sure people saw it. The county's investigation was supposed to take weeks, but Maple Ridge had turned into such a high-profile mess that everything moved fast. Too fast for Karen to hide behind excuses or emails. Within days, the white inspection trucks returned, this time accompanied by city vehicles, environmental officers, and a film crew from the local Channel 9 News. I was on my porch again, coffee in one hand, camera in the other, watching the convoy pull up like an army of reason, finally arriving after a long war of stupidity. They didn't ask for permission to enter. They already had it, a court-backed enforcement order stamped with the county seal. Karen must have heard them too, because minutes later she burst out of her house in a floral robe and designer boots, her hair tied up like she was auditioning for Desperate Housewives: The Fallout. "What are you doing on my property?" she shrieked, waving her phone like it was a sword. The lead inspector, the same Miss Ramsey who had visited before, didn't even flinch. "We're here under county authorization to document and remove the illegal drainage structure." Karen's voice cracked. "You can't do this. That's private property." "No," Miss Ramsey said, calmly showing her the documents. "This is state-protected drainage. You poured concrete into an active watershed. It stopped being private the moment you did that." The cameras rolled. Every word was recorded, every flinch immortalized. By evening, the footage hit the news cycle. I didn't have to tune in to know what it looked like. I'd been there leaning against my porch railing, watching Karen realize in real time that her empire was collapsing faster than the foundations she'd ruined. The anchor's voice on the 6 o'clock broadcast was steady, almost gleeful. A local homeowners association is under investigation after allegedly filling in a natural creek, causing severe flooding and property damage to dozens of homes. County officials say criminal charges for environmental negligence are being considered. They showed drone footage of the cracked streets, the washed-out lawns, the jagged scar where my creek used to be. Then they cut to Karen, standing in the rain, yelling at reporters, mascara streaked down her cheeks. She looked less like a leader and more like a cautionary tale. The neighborhood was done pretending after that. You could feel it in the air, something had shifted. The whispers that used to circle around me had turned into conversations. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped by to talk, asking for copies of my videos, offering to sign statements, even apologizing. Brad, the guy with the cracked driveway, brought me a six-pack and said, "Man, I used to think you were just stubborn. Now I get it, you were the only one paying attention. I didn't gloat, I just nodded. Better late than never. A few days later, the county posted bright orange notice of violation signs on the community center. One copy listed the full charges against the HOA: unauthorized alteration of protected waterway, obstruction of drainage system, negligent endangerment of residential infrastructure, violation of state environmental codes, fraudulent misrepresentation of jurisdictional authority. Each fine was followed by an eye-watering number, some in the tens of thousands. Added together, it came out to over $850, 0 inches penalties and damages. The HOA didn't have that kind of money. They were finished. Karen called an emergency meeting that Friday, and despite everything, curiosity got the best of me. I went. The community center was packed again, but this time there was no pretense of control. Folding chairs creaked under the weight of angry residents. The air buzzed with wet wool and fury. Karen stood at the podium, flanked by what was left of her board. 2 nervous men who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. Her voice trembled, trying to sound authoritative but cracking under pressure. There's a lot of misinformation going around, she began her tone, somewhere between desperation and denial. The county's investigation is ongoing and these fines are temporary. Temporary, someone shouted from the back. My basement's a swimming pool. My insurance dropped me, another yelled. Karen's composure shattered. It wasn't my fault. The contractors assured me, Howard. The older board member stood again. Karen, he said quietly, the contractors had your signature on every order. She froze, staring at him like she couldn't believe he'd betray her. You don't know what you're talking about, he sighed, rubbing his temple. I've seen the invoices. The checks came from the HOA account you signed them. The room erupted again. The shouts weren't just angry anymore, they were accusatory final. People began standing, pointing, demanding her resignation. Karen's voice rose above the noise, brittle as glass. You think you're better than me. I did this for you. I tried to fix this community. Brad shouted back. You buried it. The tension snapped. The board members quietly packed their things and walked out. Karen stood alone at the podium, shaking. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked small. When she finally left the stage, no one stopped her. No one even looked up. 2 days later, a new wave of news hit, this time from the state's environmental office. The HOA wasn't just being fined, they were being sued. Criminal negligence, fraud, tampering with a protected ecosystem. The article quoted an anonymous whistleblower who had provided detailed evidence of the HOA's illegal activity. That whistleblower was me, of course. And while the lawsuits gathered steam, nature kept doing its work. The cracks in the pavement grew wider. Sinkholes formed where the ground had been hollowed out by trapped water. A section of the main road collapsed, completely cutting off half the neighborhood from direct access to the highway. The city declared it a public hazard. Utility companies moved in to shut down gas lines, electricity, and water until the damage could be assessed. The once perfect suburban dream of Maple Ridge was now a ghost town of condemned houses and evacuation notices. Karen's home was one of the first red-tagged. The front porch had sunk 3 inches, pulling the columns askew. Her once immaculate roofline now sagged, water dripping from every eave. I saw her standing there the morning they posted the sign, staring at it motionless. Later, I heard she tried to claim the HOA's insurance for her personal property damages. The company's response was one line long: claim denied, due to gross negligence and violation of environmental law. She'd built her world on paperwork and signatures, and now the paperwork had turned against her. The county scheduled a press conference in front of the Maple Ridge entrance sign. Reporters gathered, cameras rolling, as officials outlined the results of their investigation. I watched from a distance, leaning against my truck, hands in my jacket pockets. Miss Ramsey stepped up to the microphone. The findings are clear, she said. This HOA's actions directly caused extensive property damage and environmental degradation. Restitution will be pursued. Additionally, a court order has been filed to restore the natural creek to its original state. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She wasn't done. We'd like to thank the resident who provided the documentation and footage that made this investigation possible. Without their persistence, the truth might have stayed buried. She didn't name me, but she didn't need to. Every head turned in my direction. Karen wasn't there that day. She'd stopped showing her face in public. But even if she had been, I don't think she would have recognized me anymore. The quiet guy with the folding chair by the creek was gone. What remained was someone who'd learned that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud, it's lawful. As the press dispersed, I walked to the newly posted sign at the entrance, freshly bolted beside the old Maple Ridge plaque. Environmental Restoration Site, protected by county ordinance. The irony was delicious. The HOA had once fined me for not cutting my reeds. Now the county was paying people to plant more. I stood there for a long time, letting the cool wind carry the smell of wet earth and new beginnings. The creek wasn't just coming back. It was stronger, wider, freer. And as I watched sunlight glint off its rippling surface, I realized this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about balance. Because nature doesn't seek vengeance, it simply corrects. And when it does, the correction is absolute. If the county's investigation had been a storm, the state's response was a tsunami. Within 3 weeks, Maple Ridge became a case study in every law school and city planning department across Colorado. News crews from Denver parked their satellite vans along the ruined cul-de-sac, drones hummed overhead, and environmental lawyers sniffed the air like wolves around a fresh kill. The HOA board had vanished like rats off a sinking ship, but Karen, poor, stubborn Karen, refused to let go. She started appearing on local radio ranting about government overreach and media conspiracies. In one interview, she even claimed I had doctored the videos as if I had built a fake cement truck in my backyard just to ruin her week. But the county's evidence was airtight. The drone footage, the permit violations, the contractor's sworn statements, and most damning of all, the invoices with Karen's digital signature payment authorized for drainage fill and surface stabilization. The moment those surfaced, even her last allies fled. The remaining board members lawyered up and pointed fingers at her. She approved everything, one of them told reporters. We just signed what she handed us. She must have thought she could scare the truth back into hiding. But the truth had already gone viral. It started small, a Reddit post titled HOA Floods Itself After Filling in Creek, and within a week it had over 1,000,000 upvotes. People couldn't get enough of the irony. Memes spread like wildfire. Karen with a bucket labeled problem solving, pouring cement into a creek. Another of a frog wearing sunglasses under the caption, nature always wins. I didn't post any of it, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't laugh. Then the bigger outlets picked it up. CNN ran a short segment. A suburban HOA in Colorado faces criminal charges after illegally filling in a natural drainage creek, resulting in catastrophic flooding. NBC's headline was even better, the HOA that tried to pave over nature and lost everything. Karen's name was everywhere. Her photo taken mid-scream during the inspection was printed on front pages across the state. She became the face of what every homeowner feared most: unchecked HOA power gone mad. The lawsuits came next. A class action suit from the residents for property damage. A civil suit from the county for environmental restoration costs. Even the state attorney general filed charges for willful negligence, resulting in environmental destruction. The numbers were staggering: millions in combined damages. The HOA's insurance provider, Cornerstone Mutual, released a public statement that might as well have been a tombstone. Due to clear evidence of intentional misconduct, all claims related to Maple Ridge are void under the exclusions for fraudulent and unlawful acts. In short, nobody was getting paid. Not the homeowners. Not the HOA. Not even Karen. The first foreclosure signs appeared within a month. One by one, the proud beige houses of Maple Ridge went dark. Families packed U-Hauls, their kids wading through mud to say goodbye to friends. Lawns that once competed for HOA Yard of the Month turned brown and wild. Mold crawled up walls and mosquitoes filled the air where sprinklers used to sing. By December, half the neighborhood was abandoned. The city sent in heavy machinery to tear up the cracked roads and pull out the failed storm drains. When they reached my backyard, I stood on the porch and watched as the excavator clawed up the last slabs of concrete the HOA had poured. Beneath it, dark, cold water shimmered like a secret returning to the light. The operator, a burly guy in an orange vest, cut the engine and leaned out of the cab. "You the one who started this whole thing?" he asked. I hesitated. "You could say that," he grinned. "Good. About damn time someone reminded these people the land was here first." Karen, meanwhile, spiraled. Her social media pages became a minefield of angry comments and mockery. Former neighbors she'd fined for unsightly garden gnomes now shared her mugshot from the courthouse steps. Because yes, eventually, the sheriff came. They didn't haul her off in cuffs like in a movie. It was quieter, sadder. A simple white county SUV parked in front of her sagging house. 2 deputies walked her out. She didn't fight, she didn't yell, she just looked deflated. The official charge: environmental negligence and falsification of documents. She posted bail within the hour, but the damage was done. The HOA was officially dissolved that same day. A county notice was nailed to the old community center door. The Maple Ridge Homeowners Association has ceased operations. All governing authority now rests with the county pending liquidation of assets. The assets, of course, amounted to almost nothing. The HOA's beautification fund had been drained years earlier on parties, signs, and Karen's pet projects. The rest was eaten by legal fees. By the end of the month, the community center was gutted, windows broken, mold crawling up the drywall, the words "Nature Wins" spray-painted in green across the entrance. One cold morning in January, I found her again. Karen's house had been condemned weeks before, but she hadn't left. The porch sagged under the weight of debris, plastic bins, boxes of papers, a broken flower pot. She sat in a folding chair, bundled in a coat, staring at the ruined lawn where her roses used to grow. When she saw me, her eyes narrowed, but the fire was gone. "You must be proud of yourself," she said, voice hoarse. I stopped at the edge of her property. "No," I said quietly, "just relieved." She snorted. "Relieved you destroyed me." I shook my head. "You destroyed yourself." I just made sure everyone saw it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of running water filled the silence, the creek alive again, winding through its reborn channel. You could hear it from anywhere now, a soft rush that sounded almost like laughter. Karen followed the sound with her eyes. "You really think you won?" she asked bitterly. I smiled. I didn't have to win. I just had to wait. A week later, she was gone. Her SUV vanished from the driveway. Word was she'd sold what was left of the house for pennies and moved 2 towns over, maybe to stay with family. No one cared enough to find out. The county crews came in soon after. They tore down the last condemned houses, scraped away the debris, and began the restoration. The plan was ambitious: rebuild the wetlands, plant native species, and re-establish the natural watershed. And it worked. By spring, the air smelled cleaner. Grass pushed through the old concrete. Willow trees rooted along the bank, their branches dipping into the flowing water. Frogs returned. So did the herons. The neighborhood, or what was left of it, was no longer a suburb, it was a sanctuary. The county designated it as a protected environmental corridor open for public access. The sign at the entrance changed again: Maple Ridge Creek Preserve, nature reclaimed. I still lived in my same old house. Fixed the roof. Repainted the porch. My property, once the target of endless HOA violations, was now listed as a heritage parcel under state protection. Nobody could touch it, not ever again. Some evenings I'd sit outside with a cup of coffee, watching the creek shimmer under the setting Sunday. The water whispered over the stones, soft but steady, like an old friend returning home. Sometimes I thought about Karen, not with anger, not even pity, but a strange kind of understanding. People like her don't see the land as alive. They see it as something to own, shape, and control. But the earth doesn't bend forever. It remembers. And when it remembers, it balances the scales. The last time I visited what remained of the old community center, wildflowers had already taken over. Bees hummed through the cracks in the walls. The rusted sign out front still bore faint letters: Maple Ridge HOA. I reached up, tore it down, and tossed it into the creek. It drifted away quietly, carried by the current toward the horizon. The sound of water faded into the distance, soft and endless, like the laughter of the land itself. Spring returned to Maple Ridge like an apology letter from the earth itself, the kind written not with ink, but with rain and new life. By March, you could barely recognize the place that had once been a swamp of arrogance and lawsuits. The county's restoration crews had finished the heavy work and stepped back, letting nature take the reins. What used to be cracked asphalt was now soft soil covered in wild grass and tiny white flowers that bloomed between the stones. The creek, my creek, ran freely again, a ribbon of clear water twisting through the heart of what was once the HOA's pride and joy. The frogs were back first, their croaks echoing like old songs. Then came the dragonflies, glinting blue and gold in the sunlight. Birds nested in the willows, fish darted through the shallows, and every breeze carried that fresh, wet earth smell I hadn't realized I'd missed so much. The neighborhood was smaller now, half the homes gone swallowed by time and insurance settlements, but the people who remained were different too. The fences were lower, the smiles were real. Nobody cared if your grass grew an inch too long, or if your shutters weren't color coordinated with community guidelines. The only rule now was simple: don't fight nature, work with it. One morning, I woke up to find 3 kids' neighbors from one of the few rebuilt houses splashing barefoot in the creek, their laughter echoing up the valley. Their mother waved from her porch, embarrassed, but I waved back and said, "Let them play. That's what it's there for." She smiled in relief. And just like that, the land that had divided us was binding us together again. It took me weeks to rebuild what the flood had damaged. I fixed the shed, replaced the fence, and reseeded the soil with native plants instead of store-bought turf. I spent more time outside than I had in years, hands deep in the dirt, feeling it breathe again. One afternoon, while clearing out the last of the debris, I found a piece of old concrete lodged in the bank, a remnant of the HOA's drainage project. The edge was still smooth, stamped faintly with the date 2019. I ran my fingers across the cold surface, remembering the day the cement trucks came rumbling in. The memory didn't sting anymore. It was just history. A cautionary monument to the time someone tried to control what couldn't be controlled. I carried that chunk up to the edge of my property and set it upright in the soil. Then, with my old whittling knife, I carved 3 simple words across its face: nature always wins. It wasn't meant as a boast. It was a reminder to anyone who came after that some things aren't ours to dictate. The county eventually invited me to speak at a small ceremony marking the completion of the restoration. I almost said no, I wasn't much for speeches, but Miss Ramsey, the environmental officer who had helped shut the HOA down, called me personally. "You're the reason this place got its creek back," she said. "People should hear the story from you." So I went. The ceremony was simple, a few folding chairs under a white tent beside the water. Reporters from a couple of local stations showed up, but it wasn't the media circus it had been a year earlier. Just a few dozen people, residents, officials, volunteers, gathered under a bright sky that felt freshly washed. Miss Ramsey opened with a short speech about the resilience of ecosystems and the importance of community stewardship. Then she handed me the microphone. I looked out over the crowd, the creek glinting behind them, and tried to find the right words. "I used to think peace meant quiet," I began. "That if I could just sit by this creek with a cold drink and no one bothering me, I'd have everything I needed. But I was wrong. Peace isn't silence, it's balance. And balance means respecting the things that were here before us." A light breeze rippled through the tent. The water murmured in the background as if agreeing. This creek wasn't man-made. It wasn't planned on paper or approved by committee. It was carved by time and patience long before any of us paid a mortgage. The HOA thought they could rewrite that story with concrete and bylaws. But you can't find gravity. You can't evict the rain. Nature doesn't file lawsuits, but it never forgets, and it never forgives arrogance. A few people chuckled softly. Others nodded. When they poured cement over this water, they thought they were protecting the neighborhood. But what they really did was kill the thing that protected them. The creek didn't destroy Maple Ridge. Their pride did. I paused, then watching the sunlight dance over the surface of the water. So if there's one lesson this place should leave behind, it's this: you don't own the land, you borrow it. And if you mistreat it, it will take itself back. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then applause rippled softly, genuine and warm. Miss Ramsey smiled at me and whispered, "That's going in the report." After the ceremony, I stayed behind while everyone else packed up. The sun was low, casting gold light across the water. I walked along the bank listening to the hum of crickets and the lazy buzz of dragonflies. At one spot near the bend, I noticed something glinting under the surface, a small, rusted metal plate half buried in silt. I pulled it free. It was the old HOA property marker, the one they'd installed to define common boundaries. I turned it over, mud dripping from the corners, and laughed quietly. The engraving read, "Maple Ridge Ho. Est. 2008. I tossed it into the current and watched it drift away downstream until it vanished. Life moved on. The lawsuits dragged through the courts for another year, but I didn't follow them closely. The state won, of course. Karen was fined heavily and barred from holding any future leadership positions in community organizations. Last I heard, she was living in a small rental near Denver, far from any property with an HOA. Sometimes I wondered if she ever thought about the creek, if she missed the illusion of control she'd once wielded like a crown. But mostly I just hoped she'd learned something. As for me, I started volunteering with the county's environmental group. I gave talks at local schools showing drone footage of the flood and explaining how drainage systems worked, how wetlands protect neighborhoods, and why no one should ever try to improve what nature already perfected. Kids loved the part where the frogs took revenge. Adults loved the moral. Everyone loved the ending. Because there's something satisfying about watching arrogance collapse under the weight of its own stupidity, especially when it's poetic, legal, and completely natural. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, I sat by the creek with a thermos of coffee and listened to the water murmur against the stones. Fireflies blinked along the bank. The world felt still but not dead alive in the quiet way only healed places can be. I thought about my grandfather, about the old envelope he'd left me, about the patience he must have had to save those papers all those years. Maybe he'd known something I hadn't that the land remembers even when people don't. I took out a small notebook and wrote one last line. Not for the news, not for any record, just for me. They filled my creek with concrete. I let the creek fill their lives with truth. I closed the notebook, took a long breath and smiled. The frogs croaked louder. The current caught the moonlight. And somewhere in that eternal rhythm of wind and water I felt something pure, steady and forgiving. Peace. Real peace. The kind that doesn't come from revenge or victory or even justice, just from knowing that the world, if left to its own design, always finds its way back. And so will we if we're smart enough to listen. No matter how much we pave, plan, or legislate, we are still guests on this planet. You can't bully the soil, sue the weather, or vote against gravity. The land doesn't speak in bylaws, it speaks in floods, in cracks, in the quiet return of running water. Every act of greed leaves a scar. Every act of respect lets it heal. So the next time someone tells you they can control nature, remember Maple Ridge. Remember Karen's kingdom of concrete. Remember that peace isn't built on power, it's built on harmony. And if this story made you feel something, anger, hope, or even satisfaction, drop your thoughts in the comments, share your own story, and hit subscribe. Because there will always be more battles between man and land, but only one truth worth repeating: nature always wins.